All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're unpacking an incredible historical anomaly today, one that honestly sounds like a pub trivia punchline but was actually a major imperial event. When we think of wars, we typically imagine conflicts stretching over months, years, or even decades, fundamentally altering the course of generations. But history is full of surprises. Today, we're looking at a military conflict that was over almost as soon as it began, yet it still managed to completely restructure a nation's sovereignty.
So, 38, that is the magic number here. What's really wild about this number is that it represents the entire duration, in minutes, of the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896. Just 38 minutes. To put that into perspective for you, you could start a load of laundry, and before the wash cycle even finishes, a sovereign state could completely lose a war and its independence. But how on earth does an international conflict escalate, break out, and fully resolve itself in less than 3/4 of an hour?
Let's look at Part 1, the scramble for Africa and the intense rivalry of the late 19th century.
To understand how a war could end faster than an episode of your favorite sitcom, we kind of have to pull back the curtain on the geopolitical chess game of the era. European powers were heavily vying for control, and Zanzibar found itself caught right in the middle of this intense rivalry between the British and German empires. So, under the 1890 Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, Britain gained significant influence over Zanzibar, officially turning it into a protectorate. And crucially, this agreement secured the British a veto power over the appointment of any future sultans. This wasn't just some diplomatic formality either. It was a strict mechanism to ensure whoever sat on the throne would be highly favorable to British interests, especially their long-held objective to eradicate the local slave trade.
Moving on to Part 2, a royal succession crisis, which kicked off on August 25, 1896.
The real catalyst for our 38-minute war was a ticking clock that started with the sudden and, frankly, suspicious death of the pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini. Almost immediately, his 29-year-old nephew, Khalid bin Bargash, moved into the palace. Now, some people definitely suspected Khalid of assassinating the late Sultan, and he totally ignored the treaty requirements to get British approval. By the end of that very same day, Khalid had gathered a force of 2,800 armed men in the palace square, including 700 Zanzibari Askari soldiers, perfectly setting the stage for a massive standoff.
Obviously, the British were not thrilled. The top British diplomat in Zanzibar, Basil Cave, warned Khalid multiple times to step down. When London finally authorized Cave to use military force if necessary, he sent a final ultimatum. And Khalid? Well, he boldly sent this stubborn declaration back to the British consulate on the morning of August 27th. "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." Basically, Khalid was calling their bluff.
But Consul Basil Cave fired back with this remarkably cold and direct response. He made it absolutely crystal clear that the British were not bluffing at all. The ultimatum was set to expire at exactly 9 a.m. local time. The silence hanging over Zanzibar the night before was described by another diplomat as just appalling. The usual sounds of beating drums were completely gone, and that clock just kept ticking toward the morning deadline.
Which brings us to Part 3, the tale of the tape, and what was a truly massive mismatch.
So before the first shot was even fired, you have to understand the sheer inequality of these two forces. Rear Admiral Harry Rawson had this naval fleet parked right in the harbor, featuring heavily armed protected cruisers and several gunboats, absolutely loaded with high explosive shells. Khalid's men, on the other hand, were relying on a few modern machine guns, an obsolete 17th century bronze cannon, and a wooden royal yacht to defend a palace complex that was completely unsuited to withstand modern naval artillery.
All right, Part 4, the 38-minute battle on the morning of August 27, 1896. Time compressed incredibly quickly here. After a final parley was requested at 08 a.m., the ultimatum officially expired at 09 a.m. The order was given, and at exactly 09:02 a.m., the British ships opened fire simultaneously. It was devastating. The very first shot instantly disabled the defending Arab artillery. Thousands of defenders were trapped in the largely wooden palace complex, which just erupted in flames from the high explosive shells. By 09:40 a.m., just 38 minutes later, the flag at the palace was shot down, the artillery was completely silenced, and the firing ceased entirely.
Now, right in the middle of this absolute onslaught, there is actually a tiny, localized naval battle. In a totally futile act of resistance at 09:05 a.m., the Sultan's wooden royal yacht actually fired its guns, which included a Gatling gun gifted by Queen Victoria, interestingly enough, at a British cruiser. The British immediately returned fire, and the yacht was promptly sunk into the shallow harbor. Its crew actually had to hoist a British flag to surrender before being rescued.
Finally, Part 5. Casualties and Imperial Legacy, the devastating aftermath of those 38 minutes.
Look, while a 38-minute war might sound like an amusing piece of trivia, a war you could literally sleep through if you hit the snooze button a few times, the aftermath reveals a very sobering reality of late 19th century imperialism. The high-explosive shelling was catastrophic. Roughly 500 Zanzibari men and women were killed or wounded. Because the palace complex was largely made of timber, it caught fire incredibly fast, trapping defenders, servants, and slaves inside. Khalid's gun crews were reportedly completely decimated.
Now I want you to contrast that staggering loss of life with this single number: 1. Just one single British petty officer was severely wounded during the brief exchange, and he later fully recovered. The sheer asymmetry of this conflict is perfectly encapsulated by comparing those 500 Zanzibari casualties to this one single British injury.
So, what happened to Sultan Khalid? Well, he famously fled the burning palace at the first shots and sought refuge in the nearby German consulate. Utilizing a diplomatic loophole and the fact that the German consul flat out refused to extradite a political prisoner, he was actually smuggled out at high tide onto a German warship and taken to German East Africa. But by that very afternoon, the British had already achieved their main goal. They swiftly installed their preferred, highly compliant ruler, Sultan Hamid, straight into power.
Ultimately, this brief, intense bombardment permanently stripped the Sultanate of its independence. The physical palace was demolished, the government became essentially British-run, and get this, the British actually forced the captured supporters of Khalid to pay 300,000 rupees in reparations just to cover the cost of the artillery shells that had been fired at them. It cemented a heavy-handed British rule that would see absolutely no further rebellions for the remaining 67 years of the Protectorate. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've seen the build-up, the staggering mismatch of power, and the truly devastating aftermath. And it leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder. Just how much permanent damage, loss of life, and massive geopolitical restructuring can an empire accomplish in the exact same time it takes you to drink a cup of coffee? It is a stark, fascinating reminder that in the shadow of imperial power, history can turn on a dime. Or, in this case, a mere 38 minutes on a Thursday morning.